Hey there, my wedding planning friends, and welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time here, thank you so much for clicking on my video. I'm Emily Summer. I'm a wedding planner based in Montana and also the owner of Velvet Bride, which is a wedding dress store in Missoula, Montana, and I make weekly videos on wedding planning tips and advice. So today we're talking all about wedding venues and specifically wedding venue site visits. And this is something that I've talked about before, and I realized that if you have not gone through one, there's a good chance that you have no idea what I'm talking about when I use the term venue site visit. So we will break that down and talk about that today to help you make the most of your wedding site visit and know how to prepare. So a wedding venue site visit differs from a wedding venue tour, where the wedding venue tour is what you do in the process of selecting your wedding venue. You're going to tour a lot of venues, ask some questions, be able to see the whole space before you actually book your wedding venue. A wedding site visit then is something that you do once you have already booked and paid for and solidified your wedding venue. Typically, this will happen a little bit closer to your wedding date. A lot of venues that I work with will typically do a site visit about 30 days prior to the wedding date, but this can vary depending on the venue that you choose in your location, but usually fairly close to the wedding date. And the purpose of this site visit is to give you an opportunity to walk through the space again. A lot of times you are probably booking your venue very, very early in the stages of wedding plans, and maybe you haven't seen it since that initial tour, or maybe you didn't even get to see it in person in your tour, and you did that virtually or just through photos. And so this is an opportunity to be able to walk through the space and see everything and be able to envision it prior to your wedding day, be able to finalize any layout details, vision, and ask any additional questions you have for the wedding venue and make sure you're both on the same page as far as regulations, rules, policies, and expectations. So what exactly happens at a wedding venue site visit? There will likely be some overlap from a wedding venue tour that you did in the beginning process if you were able to do an actual physical on-site tour. There will likely be some overlap between what happens at your wedding site visit from that initial tour that you took, where you will walk the grounds, walk through the whole space, and go through each room and part of the venue and just make sure that you are, maybe it's a refresher for you if you've forgotten, or just make sure that you are asking any additional questions and clarifying anything in each of those spaces. So being able to visualize your ceremony and make sure that the idea that you had in your mind is what's going to actually physically work in the space for both your ceremony site as well as your reception site. In addition to just walking through the space, whoever is hosting this site visit, which is usually the venue manager or coordinator or maybe the owner, depending on how large the venue is. And they will likely be prompting a lot of the questions or details for you as you go through the space as well. But this is a great opportunity to make sure that you are fully understanding what their rules and policies are for their venue, for their kitchen space, for their bridal party getting ready spaces and all of that. You also want to be discussing the layout for both ceremony and reception and make sure you're on the same page for that. And again, that the ideas that you have in your head are going to work physically in the space. And this is a great time to kind of finalize those layout related details. So not only your seating chart, like where your guests are going to sit for dinner, but also layout details such as where your wedding cake and or dessert table is going to go, where your welcome table or gift table is going to go, where your bar is going to go, and those types of things. So it's also a good opportunity to scope out spaces that you especially like for photos, good backdrops for maybe your first look or for your bridal portraits, and having some ideas in your mind about where you want specific photos taking place. If your photographer has worked at your venue before, there's a good chance that they already have some of their favorite spots in mind and will kind of lead the way when it comes to this, especially dependent on what the weather and the lighting might be doing that day. But it's not a bad idea to still have some ideas and requests in the back of your mind that you can provide your photographer to give a little bit more guidance. A little note here too, it's also helpful if you are able to schedule your wedding site visit around the same time that your wedding is going to be taking place. So So it'll likely be fairly close to your wedding date as far as like the season and the time of year it will be. But if you're able to schedule it around the time, so say your ceremony is going to start at 4 p.m. to have your site visit around 3:30 or 4 p.m. That way you can get a good idea of where the lighting is going to be, what the temperature might be that time of day, and those types of things, so you can really see the space at the same time that your wedding is going to be occurring. Who is included in your wedding site visit? Typically, like I mentioned, the wedding venue owner or manager or coordinator will likely be the one to be running this site visit with you. It won't just be something that you are kind of doing on your own or a self-tour. And then both partners, you and your partner, should both be there if possible. That way you can both kind of discuss your vision and details together in the same place. And then if you have a wedding planner, this is also something that you should definitely have them be a part of, to not only help kind of guide conversations and maybe ask questions that you haven't thought of, but to give some insight onto ideas that you might have, and just to be physically there for those conversations discussing layout and those types of things in the space. They can give insight on what has worked well in the venue in their experience, or what hasn't worked so well. And like I said, just come up with some things that maybe you haven't thought about as far as questions and details go. Speaking of questions, here are some questions that you should ask or make sure that you leave having answers to from your wedding venue site visit. Number one, what time do you have access to the venue? Do you have access to the venue just the day of? Is that it? Do you have access to it the day before, the night before at all, to drop stuff off? If it's just the day of, how early can you get in? And just understand the expectations for how much time you are allowed in the space for setup and cleanup. You also want to make sure that you are clarifying their cleanup rules. Does the space have to be completely spotless the way that you came in? Are you responsible for the actual cleanup, like sweeping or cleaning the getting ready areas or anything like that? Or do you just need physical personal items and decor out? Is there any decor that you can leave overnight if it's getting picked up the next day from a rental company? Make sure that you are clarifying those details so that you aren't hit with any extra fees or stuck, having to take things out the night of and not having anywhere to put them. It's also good to make sure that you are on the same page on what time you have to vacate the venue, and if this differs from the time that you have to have music off. So sometimes this should be listed in your contract, but sometimes venues will have two different times, like 11 p.m. is when the party has to end, and then you have until 12 to be completely out and have everything out. So make sure that you're understanding what those parameters are and what those regulations are when it comes to vacating the space and the cleanup. You also want to make sure that you are discussing a rain plan or a plan B. If you're planning to have any part of your wedding outside, this is the opportunity to discuss what your plan B is going to be in case there is any inclement weather that is going to make having an outdoor ceremony or cocktail hour or reception difficult or impossible on your wedding day. You also want to ask if you are allowed to have any outside food or beverage on site. Sometimes venues will be providing all of the food and alcohol themselves, so they will not allow you to bring on any outside alcohol or food. Sometimes this can vary depending on what their liquor license is. You might not be able to bring outside alcohol for that reason. So if you are planning to have anything food, drink wise while getting ready, while setting up, make sure that you are communicating this with your venue and understanding what their rules and policies are for this. It's also good to know where all of the electrical hookups or lights, switches, all that sorts of thing are during your site visit. If you need to discuss with your DJ and make sure they know where the electrical hookups are, or this might change where your layout details, where you're going to place the DJ, that sort of thing. Note where those types of details are during your wedding venue site visit. Also ask and discuss what the setup expectations are for both you and for the venue. Is everything completely on you? Is there anything that the venue provides? Typically, if the venue has their own tables and chairs, a lot of times they will provide the setup for this, so placing them where they need to go per whatever layout you guys discussed and decided on. But that's not always the case. Some venues that have their own tables and chairs can supply the setup for an additional fee. So just make sure that you are understanding what those expectations are so that there are no surprises on the day of and you have the proper help that you need when it comes to setting up the day of your wedding. Also, ask and check for things like storage space for any extra decor boxes or personal items that you're going to have the day of your wedding. Is there a place to store all those things so they're going to be out of sight by the time the wedding actually starts so that it's not in view or eyesight of your guests? As well as an ice machine. Is that on site? Is that something that you don't have to bring in? Do you need to bring in ice? If so, check for fridge and freezer storage and make sure it's going to accommodate what your needs are, or if there are additional plans you will need to make to suit your needs. And finally, discuss parking. Make sure that you are on the same page on what the parking requirements and expectations and abilities are. Is there a large parking area where it's not going to be an issue? Your guests can drive themselves and have a place to park? Is there going to be a smaller lot that only some of your guests can use and you are providing a transportation service and need to make sure to communicate with your guests that there's a very limited parking on site? If there is parking on site, are people able to leave their cars overnight if you are providing transportation back at the end of the venue so that people aren't driving home after having some beverages? Make sure you're asking any of these questions that might be needed so that you fully understand what the parking situation is going to be for your wedding day. Wedding venue site visits is where everything really starts to come together and be real. This is where a lot of these final decisions will be made and kind of pull everything together and see what little last minute details still need to be finalized and what needs to be discussed and determined. So hopefully you found this video helpful. If you did, please like and subscribe to get weekly videos of wedding planning tips and advice, and we'll see you next week.